Okay, we're going to look at Ben Jonson today, and with Jonson move in a direction of a different school of poetics than we've looked at thus far. We've largely focused, let me see here for the syllabus, where is it? It is here. We have thus far focused largely on the metaphysical poets. Why is that not shrinking? Still not shrinking, okay. So we looked at Donne and Herbert, and those two will be metaphysical poets, early generation. But contemporaneous with that is another significant poetic movement that we're going to call classicism, that is associated primarily with Ben Jonson. And I wanted to say a little bit about that school because we're going to look at Jonson. Then next time we're going to look at Amelia Lanier as well, alongside other works by Jonson, and then Robert Herrick before returning to the metaphysicals, Marvell, Vaughan, and Traherne. Note that on this course I've cut out Milton. I did that for a couple of reasons. One, so I could include more of the other poets of the era. And secondly, he doesn't really fit any of the schools of poetry, if you want to see it that way. He is a very unique figure. Although he's smack dab in the middle of the 17th century, he's not a metaphysical poet. I would not call him a classicist, although you could see him as very classicist in many respects, but he's a little bit too idiosyncratic. He knows his own mind too much, and he is happy to dissent on issues on which he thinks other schools are simply going astray, and that will include the classics. So Jonson does not seek to write an epic, but Milton does. The epic is a tradition of poetry that we see in the 16th century is best represented by Edmund Spenser. And Spenser is a Protestant allegorist, which carries on into the 17th century in the form of Pilgrim's Progress. But then we're dealing more with a novel rather than a poem, so I've just excluded it from the course just for reason of I just don't have enough time. I'd like to take a whole year to do 17th century poetry. When I did study 17th century poet, Milton was thrown in with this lot, and I've just cut him out and made a whole course for Milton unto himself. And now, so we're looking at the rest of the 17th century. And as I say, this school that I'm going to look at, the Sons of Ben, led by Ben Jonson and followed by others, is, I would say, the other dominant school of poetics in the period. And I would say that Marvell, whom we're going to see, and Vaughan and Traherne will continue to write metaphysical poetry into the second half of the 17th century. But in general, the style of Donne and Herbert degenerates in this period. And in lesser poets, it becomes very superficial and like a decorative device as much as anything. So it sort of loses its original moral and cosmological frame. Like I've talked about the microcosm and the macrocosm and the theological framework there that gets applied in countless ways. That's characteristic of Donne and Herbert. Later on, it loses this feature, and in Abraham Cowley, we get the more of a imitative type thing. So Shakespeare later will compare Cowley to Milton. Say one's a poet of genius, the other is a poet of the fancy, referring to Cowley. We're not even going to look at Cowley. But the Renaissance world picture that I spoke of at the outset, the Elizabethan world picture, was challenged by the scientific revolution. And so in the late 17th century, the Royal Society is begun, and it is concurrent with the restoration of the monarchy. Charles II comes back, And that has a significant shift on sensibilities, not just because of the political change, but because there are different mannerisms and even an intellectual framework in France as opposed to England. And chiefly it's this, probably influenced by Cartesian science, Descartes. So in England, we already have Bacon, whom we looked at, Francis Bacon, and the empirical method and the idea of exercising power over nature, which is so much a part of the framework and even the mood of modern science, gaining power through scientific innovation and through technological devices, gaining power over nature, like using a smartphone, and trying to keep pushing on innovation in order to gain more and more power over the world around us. So it's it's sort of a dominion mandate, if you want to go back to a Genesis framework. But one of the challenges with this is, what's the difference between dominion and domination? And in Bacon's language, I think we can see very little by way of checking dominion. And it's just, and he speaks of nature as like a slave that you have to treat and put into place, and you can boss it, and you don't have any concerns about the subject matter of the nature itself. You just simply, it does what we want it to do. So gaining power over it in a sense that doesn't recognize the sanctity of the natural world in any way. And the backlash against that comes in the Romantic period, because they no longer see the natural world as having any connection. It has no metaphysical significance. There's no sense of the sanctity of a created order that God has created, or the boundaries therewith. And so the Romantics seek to recover something of the sanctity of nature, but they do it through the imagination rather than through metaphysics, right? You've done enough Romantics with me, at least some of you, to have some sense of what I'm talking about. In this period, that is the later 17th century, the classical method becomes more popular again. And the reason why is that it seems more precise and economical, and I would say a little bit more restrained in its expression. It's very careful. It seeks to present things in the briefest and most poignant form. And we're going to see that in the first two poems that we'll look at by Jonson, on his daughter and on his son. Both of them are the occasion of their deaths at a very young age. And you'll see that, as opposed to Donne's tendency to bombastic language, remember how extraordinarily powerful his utterances are. And in general, he begins with, he breaks the meter, like in Holy Sonnet 14, death be not proud, right? There's a immediate, he's on the attack in pretty much right away. There's no sense of standing back and considering how one is going to speak, and then presenting it in the most careful and precise and powerful way possible. He immediately goes for emotional fervor. And whereas Jonson is more interested in restraint and decorum, these are Augustan sensibilities, as in Caesar Augustus. These are the imperial strains. And so with the restoration of Charles II, there's a new intellectual climate that demands this sort of poetic style commensurate with science and inductive reasoning, which is detachment. I'm going to observe, I'm going to determine what I'm actually dealing with, and then I'm going to write it up in very clinical terms. And Jonson's style fits more than the metaphysical style does. We're not done with the metaphysical style. We'll, as I say, conclude with Marvell, Vaughan, and Traherne. And Marvell is probably a middle ground, a little bit more classical. But for now, we're just going to look at the classical motif. Now, in terms of how that's often expressed, there are different ways of presenting this. When I did 17th century literature in the 80s, late 80s, 1980s, the other century. The way in which it was often presented was the Cavalier poets versus the Roundheads. Cavalier being, King Charles and more representing the classical, versus the Roundheads, namely the Puritans. And the Puritans tended towards the metaphysical. The problem with that is that it's not real. It's more of they're trying to determine poetics in conjunction with politics. And that doesn't, or even religion, and it doesn't really fit, because you'll find that there are poets that will write more classicist, but they're puritanical in their inclinations. And so it's got nothing to do with it. So whenever you're teaching any subject, you try and give people ways of understanding a broader swathe of individuals and try to categorize them to explain how one poet is different from another, or one writer, or one individual, or one political party. Well, what is it that defines this party, and what is it that defines this one? And we'll show them as in conflict over ideas and so forth. In the end, it's not quite as simple as that. And then when you get to Mr. Milton, as I say, he, although he's a Puritan, doesn't fit in with the metaphysical poets at all, really, although he likes Donne. He's moved by Donne. I'm sure likewise Herbert. And although he writes epic like Spenser and sees Spenser as a great role model, he doesn't use allegory. He really does seem more of a classicist, and it appeals to the classical models of epic. So he appeals to Virgil and Homer. He's not appealing, he doesn't even mention Dante, which is an extraordinary thing, given the estimation of Dante in our day, and the fact that Milton actually reads Italian and has surely read Dante, but you almost see no influence of Dante in Milton's great epic work, which is, I would say, about as damning as you could have it. I'm not even going to acknowledge it. The only thing I can see where he has been influenced by Dante is he begins in the Inferno. Milton does. So the beginning of Paradise Lost is he goes down to hell. That's the only place you could see it. And then Purgatory maybe would be in heaven, and then back down to Paradiso. It doesn't really fit. So just the beginning. Otherwise, really almost pays no attention to him. So Milton is his own thing, and I'm not doing him on this course for that reason. But we are looking at at Jonson and his influence. Now, his influence on Jacobean and Carolinian poetry. Jacobean is the poetry related to King James, the man who inspires the King James Bible, the authorized version of the Bible, which for English speakers is the sort of the standard version. So his brief reign overlapping the end of Shakespeare's life, and the Caroline period, which is Charles I. And Jonson has an influence on both of those. Remember, he's a contemporary of Shakespeare, Jonson, and he's considered to be the great dramatist of his day, might I add. Nobody reads Jonson's dramas anymore, although if you do go to Stratford, you will find they occasionally, or even reasonably regularly, put on Jonson's plays, like Volpone or something like that. So he is writing, he is writing drama, but his chief, the chief source of his fame is writing as a poet, like everyone in this age. And his influence on both Jacobean and Caroline poetry is at least as great as Donne's. And so what we find here, even in a writer like Herrick, who is one of the sons of Ben, probably the most devout of the sons of Ben, is this capacity to pull hidden and subtle shades of meaning into a brief line of verse. And you'll see this when we look at the poetry. So there's almost, in the case of Herrick, a submerged condemnation of Puritan ethics. We'll look at that when we come to Herrick. But we find a great restraint and precision and decorum and reliance on wit. So wit is something I need to discuss here briefly. wit is a type of learned and wise expression. So when we think of poetry, we tend to think of language that moves us. If we thought of it only in those terms, we'd be thinking like romantics, because that's what we value in poetry. It moves us. For Jonson and his age, and this will include all of the poets of his age, if it only moves you, it's probably as likely to be propaganda as it is to be poetry. Moving you is insufficient. It has to hold on to truths and to expound them and to lead you into adopting truths in order for it to be doing what it's supposed to be doing. And poets of this period and the Renaissance period are quite clear in their convictions that the poet has a responsibility to teach and to delight, both. You have to teach, and you have to teach truth, and you will be accountable for what you are teaching. So just moving people is not necessarily a sign of a good poet, because a poet has a moral responsibility as a teacher. So moving people towards the right things, that's the question of a poet. Do you move people to hold on to the truths of time immemorial and encourage people to live better lives, etc.? That's the key question, which come the Romantic period, and certainly our period, we lose sight of entirely. Nowadays, people write and tell me they want to be writers, and in other words, they want to move people, because that's what writers want to do. They want to persuade, they want to use their gifts and so forth. The question is, do you have the wisdom to do that in a way that is responsible? And I can tell you that in terms of a person's life doing a truly great work like an epic, people don't write epics at the age of 19. And there's a reason for that. You lack the wisdom to do it. Now, there are romantics that seek to do so, but they almost prove the point. An epic is a very serious form of poetry, and it tends to be written by people with a lifetime of experience and restraint and decorum and deep preparation. That's certainly the story of Milton's life, although it's inadvertent in his sense that he didn't want to wait till he was blind and not that far off from death before he writes his grand epics. It was, the intervening civil war sort of had something to do with that. But he was preparing in his early works to write a greater, more weighty, more highly regarded encyclopedic form of literature, namely the epic. And most of what we're looking here are lyric poems, and lyric poems can be written by young people just as they can be by old. However, in the case of Jonson, and we'll find Lanier and Herrick, but particularly Jonson, he combines it with wit. And wit is a type of wisdom. So it comes from the Germanic verb wissen, W-I-S-S-E-N, to wit. And it has a sense of learned knowledge. And Jonson is famous for this. His restraint, his economy, his precision, his decorum. So he will evoke very moving topics. As I say, we're about to look at the poem dedicated to the death of his daughter and the death of his son. Extraordinarily moving events. And yet his restraint has the effect of making us feel more strongly what he refuses to say. There's no vulgarity in it. We don't feel pity for Jonson. We're moved by his restraint and his manliness in holding back his tears, but we know that he is weeping because we're brought to tears by the way he expresses himself. Now, this is characteristic of the classical aim of decorum. It's a civilized form of restraint that does not deny the emotional weight of the situation. It seeks to hold back, however, and that actually expresses it in a very real sense even more potently. So he writes the sense of not only what he thinks, but what oft was thought. And he does it more felicitously than almost anyone. So let me come to look at that. Let me say a few words about Jonson himself before I do that. So in terms of timeline, he's born 1572, dies in 1637. So he overlaps. So when he's 28, it's the turn of the century. And by that point, he's already an established dramatist and seen as the great dramatist of his day, greater than Shakespeare by many estimations. They know each other well. Some people have even said that Jonson was the author of some of Shakespeare's plays. Never mind. Because he had the high learning, so he's a famous classicist, Renaissance man. Writes historically important tragedies, and his lyric poems that we're looking at have a very special position within the canon. And there's an artistry that is so perfect that it leaves an impression that there's no effort involved. So this is part of the style. It looks like there's no thought that's been put into it. It's easy to read. We would say, I could not replace a single word here. It's so perfect. And yet it doesn't strain in any way, unlike Donne. Donne is like the emotions threatening to break through the form all over the place, and he regularly breaks the form. By the way, Jonson's comment on Donne is that what Donne has done in verse deserves hanging, because he keeps breaking the form. He runs the lines over. They don't end at the end of the line. They run over. They enjam so regularly that you're losing a sense of the form. And for Jonson, this is a huge artistic failure, although he acknowledges the power of Donne's verse, but still he disapproves of the style. So it's a matter of style, but the style is connected to the substance. So that's the point. And we tend to value the breaking of the form, partly because we're romantics and we think that the form should be broken, because emotion's more important than restraint. Look at our culture. Does anyone value restraint? Look at our political leaders. Why do they speak the way they do? Look at our entertainers, the musicians, the artists. Are they models of probity and restraint? Are they respectful individuals? How come? Is it just because they're bad, or is it because we actually value excess? I think it's the latter. So there's an effortlessness about his writing, and some of his poems like On My First Son, and I'm not sure if I'm doing Drink to Me Only with Thine Eyes, I don't think so, but that are absolutely extraordinary. Let me go to, do you have comments or questions about this before I move forward? I'll leave you with this quote. This is a quote from Alexander Pope. And what oft that he writes, and this is actually, I'm wrong here in my allocation of this. It was said of Pope, but I think it holds true of Jonson, that he wrote what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. What oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. So he puts it the best. Not novel thoughts, but the best expression of those thoughts. So let's look at the first poem I proposed to. So here's the man himself. On My First Daughter. By the way, this poem is from an entry in the parish register of St. Martin's in the Fields in London, which you might know if you listen to classical music. There's it's often a venue for various performances. So it's in the parish register of St. Martin's in the Fields in London. Supposed from this that Jonson's daughter died of the plague November 1593, when Jonson himself was 21. So here it is. It's just 12 lines, but I'll try and, I don't want to shrink it so you can see the whole thing. So on my first daughter. Here lies to each her parents' ruth, Mary, the daughter of their youth. Yet all heaven's gifts, being heaven's due, it makes the Father less to rue. At 6 months' end she parted hence, with safety of her innocence, whose soul, heaven's queen, whose name she bears, in comfort of her mother's tears, hath placed amongst her virgin train, where while that severed doth remain, this grave partakes the fleshly birth, which cover lightly gentle earth. Jonson's Catholic, by the way. Written in rhyming couplets. 12-line poem. The occasion, you can imagine, the occasion almost is, it is part of, it's clearly part of the context, but the fact that he's writing it in the parish register as well. So each parish will have a register of births and deaths and marriages and so forth. He writes a poem there. And the poem there is a dedication to his daughter, who's going to be buried beneath the earth of this grave in St. Martin's in the Fields. I've not been there, but I suspect it remains there. Note that the poetry is very simple and austere. There are no, although Jonson's a classicist, there's no Latinate vocabulary, excessively so. He uses good old Anglo-Saxon words like ruth and hence. I'm trying to think if there's any Latinate stuff here. I don't think so, actually. So despite the fact that he is steeped in the classics, he's not using a Latinate vocabulary. It's very earthy. Ruth sounds almost, it's obviously the Book of Ruth, and I'm wondering if the Book of Ruth comes from the sentiment of Ruth, but I don't think it does. In scripture, it talks about marrying the woman of your youth and so forth. He's a young man. His wife is young. I don't know if this is their first child or not. I think it might be. But they've had to bury her at 6 months. It's not that she was, she died in childbirth, or they've had her for 6 months. By 6 months, the child recognizes their parents and probably is able to sit up and smiles. They'll be strong, and she'll be the apple of their eye. He'll be heartbroken when he writes this. Anyone would be, but he doesn't talk about his feelings, except by distance. And he speaks on behalf of his wife. It's on my first daughter. Yes, but he speaks equally for his wife, and you can imagine his wife not able to express her grief, but he's speaking on her behalf. Here lies to each her parents, Ruth, Mary, the daughter of their youth. It is their daughter. And of course, Ruth and youth rhyme, but it's also something of them. It's something of their innocence, which has been lost. It's something of their vitality, which has been buried beneath the earth. So it's not just that Mary has died, part of them has died with her, right? Something of their hopefulness, optimism about life has been killed when this child was buried. You can imagine it, but the way he's put it, it doesn't draw attention directly to his feelings, and yet everything that he says will have a reflection in the way he articulates that. Yet all heaven's gifts, being heaven's due, it makes the Father less to rue. So here's the restraint. The restraint is the theological awareness that God giveth and God taketh away. The child was a gift, and the gift has returned to its giver. And because of that, it makes the Father less to rue. Why? because she still has a father in heaven, not Ben Jonson, but her father in heaven. And so there's the restraint, and there's the recompense or the consolation slightly. But does that solve or end the discussion? No, it does not. At 6 months' end, she parted hence with safety of her innocence. Now note here that the line in jams, it goes on to the next line. All of these have commas or semicolons or full stops, but this one runs on to the next line. There's a little bit of loss of restraint here. It's still rhyming, but it runs over into the next line. She parted hence with safety of her innocence, whose soul, and now he keeps going back and forth. The child and my grief, the theological framework, back and forth, back and forth. And the theology is comforting the grieving man. At 6 months hence, she parted hence with safety of her innocence, whose soul, heaven's queen, whose name she bears, in comfort of her mother's tears, hath placed amongst her virgin train, where, while that severed doth remain, this grave partakes the fleshly birth, which cover lightly gentle earth. And then he pleads for the earth to be gentle with his daughter, who's still beneath the ground, at least her body is, although her soul is with Mary. The body is there. So, oh, my little girl, cover her lightly. Don't bruise her. So there's the father's compassion. There is the spiritual consolation that his child is with Mary in heaven. Whose soul, heaven's queen, whose name she bears in comfort of her mother's tears, as opposed to his wife's tears. So there's again this, the father, the mother, this grave partakes the fleshly birth. Remember, we ashes to ashes and dust to dust. You come from the ashes, or from the dust, you will return to the dust. Theologically freighted throughout. So this counterpoint between heaven and earth, between a mother and father grieving a 6-month-old child, and a father in heaven and a mother in heaven who are receiving her, that restraint of grief and yet consolation, all expressed in a 12-line poem of breathtaking ease. It's beautiful. As I say, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. Isn't it wonderful? Sadly enough, another occasion, this time with his son, his first son. Well, I'm not sure if the daughter came first before the son. I think it is the case. But he lost both of his firstborn children, girl and boy. Less common now than it was then, but not uncommon in the history of the world. Children up to a certain age are very vulnerable to disease, to cold. I mean, they're helpless. This is on my first son. Now, the occasion here is son. Oh, this is born in 1596. So this is 3 years after. And did die of the plague. In 1603, his son is now 7. This is a different order of magnitude almost. The longer your child is with you, especially when they're still innocent, but the longer they're with you, the deeper the grief, the shared memories, the development of the person, the relationship between them. 7-year-old poet was absent when his boy died. And he had a vision of his son in which, as he described later to William Drummond, the lad appeared of a manly shape. And he said, and of that growth he shall be at the resurrection. So he saw his son as most people did, and this is what people ask me about, well, you know, what's it going to be like when I die? What will I look like? And all that. Will you remember me? Like when it's my kids, you know, will we recognize each other? What will Do they die like a child dies at 6 months, 7? What will the child look like in heaven? Will it be at that age or what? I don't think Scripture is clear on it, but I think, and it may be misplaced understandings here, more Greek than anything else, but I think you end up being the mature version of yourself, fully formed, fully mature at the point of your, as it were, perfection before you start to degenerate like me. So I'll look younger. My kids, if they were to die, they would look older. Something of us is recognizable in that. But like, do you die in the decrepit old form? Like most, like if you die of old age in your 90s or whatever, like you're a shadow, a pale shadow of your former self. When you die, is that the form in which you resurrected, or is it you in your maturity and your full vigor with a renewed body? I incline towards that. That's Jonson's view of his son. He will see him as a man, maybe of his own height, looking at my eye and that sort of thing. But on my first son, 7 years old, remember, farewell, thou child of my right hand, of my right hand. Remember, Christ is at the right hand of the Father on it. And now he is at his right hand. Child of my right hand, and joy. My sin was too much hope of thee, loved boy. 7 years thou wert lent to me, and I thee pay, exacted by thy fate on the just day. Oh, could I lose all Father now? For why will man lament the state he should envy, to have so soon scaped world's and flesh's rage, and if no other misery, yet age. Rest in soft peace, and asked, say, here doth lie Ben Jonson his best piece of poetry, for whose sake henceforth all his vows be such as what he loves may never like too much. Note the consolation of wisdom is giving him, when you're in grief, you are, like in all forms of pain, you're curved in upon yourself and you only feel pain. It's like you have a toothache. You can think about nothing but the toothache. You can't think of anything else. The force of the wisdom and the wit of Ben Jonson is to give you the big perspective. He's giving himself, even though he's the writer, he's also the object of the writing. He's giving consolation to himself as a grieving husband. He's writing as a sage poet. The wisdom of the age is being given to the man, Ben Jonson, who's just lost a son. A man renowned as a poet whose greatest work is his son. And the consolation for the whole thing is the knowledge that things are only lent to us for a time. And we have to hold them lightly, including our children, including our parents, including our spouses, including the world. It's here for a time, and then it's gone. This is the counsel of Proverbs, it's the counsel of Ecclesiastes to some degree. So it's wisdom literature. This is wit expressed in this. It's not wit in the sense of humor. There's no humor in this per se, but there is wit in it. And there are regular reflections on the relation of God to his people that he brings in to console him and to remind him of the importance of the transience of this life. In our contemporary culture, we can't deal with death at all. We have celebrations of life. When someone passes, there's a celebration of life, which I find it's hard for me to express how much it upsets me, because it's just so fraudulent about the situation. You have lost somebody. You are grieving the loss of somebody. You do need consolation, but the consolation is not to think happy thoughts and then whistle while you work and carry on. And let's tell stories about so-and-so at some happy occasion where everyone shares a happy story. I don't mind hearing them, but that's not real consolation. That's distraction. Right? Diversion, distraction, entertainment is not the same thing as consolation. Consolation is wise words that will bring this particular moment of extreme grief into a proper context to understanding the meaning and purpose of life, which is what everyone wants at that point. They want to understand that the life of the person who they loved had meaning and purpose. So that's what comes, but it doesn't come in a celebration of life. It's a life in relation to the thing that's just happened, namely they've died. So I think that we get here. So that was his first daughter, now his first son. My sin was too much hope of thee. That's a hard sin not to commit as a father. All parents wish well of their children. Most parents wish their children to have a better life than they had. I mean, if you're a good parent, you want them to have, the joy of life and not the misery. Try and steer them away from the misery. You can't avoid it. Accidents happen. Misery, like events happen that bring misery, and the misery can be good, but nobody steers for the misery. So my sin was too much hope of thee, Lord. 7 years thou wert lent to me. This is again wise consideration. It's not this child is mine. It's my boy. It's my son. It's mine. You want to use the word mine, my precious. He's avoiding the Gollum Smeagol language, even though it is his precious, it's his only, it's his first son. 7 years thou wert lent to me, and I thee pay, exacted by thy fate on the just day. What does I thee pay here? I think he's going to give an answer for the way he raised his son to Christ when on the judgment day. He's still a minor. His son's a minor. That's the just day, I think, that is referred to here. Then he moves into a next rather different train of thought. Oh, could I lose all father now? For why will man lament the state he should envy? What's the state he should envy? A human being being in the presence of God, which his son now is, just like his daughter. Why am I lamenting this? I should be rejoicing. Same things that Christians feel at funerals. I've lost a loved one, but he or she is in a better place, with a better person, in a better life. Pure joy, unmitigated by pain and sorrow and crying and death. Why will man lament the state he should envy? To have so soon scaped worlds and flesh's rage, and if no other misery, yet age. There's the wise words of consolation. He's in a far better place, and he's avoided the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune in life. So, rest in soft peace. Great phrase here. And asked, say. Who's he speaking the imperative to? The audience. Here's Jonson's son. What are we to make of him? Oh, he's Ben Jonson's son. No. Here doth lie Ben Jonson, his best piece of poetry. Here's the best thing Jonson ever created. For whose sake henceforth all his vows be such, as what he loves may never like too much. He has an Augustinian framework here, and let me conclude with this. In Augustine's De Doctrina Christiana, he talks about the proper way to interpret Scripture. And he says that he compares life to a pilgrimage, a journey. And the end of the journey is to be with God. Right? The aim of life is ultimately beginning with God, we will end up with God, we will see him face to face. So all of life is compared to a journey. Now, along that way, if you love something which is there, you love it in an ultimate sense, then you're being distracted and actually impeded from your ultimate goal, which is to be with God. So all the things you love along the way are there to encourage you, and all the things that you suffer along the way are likewise there to encourage you. And so he talks about this as a motivation in how you read scripture and to put things in the right order. And this is called the ordo amoris. You're ordering your loves. And so the things that we love in this life are genuinely lovable, but they're not ultimately lovable. The ultimately lovable thing is God, and everything else is a foretaste of that. So here, what he loves, namely his son, he shouldn't like too much. There should be a little bit of, I'm not all in on this. I'm not fully invested. My whole future is not dependent on this boy. My whole life is not, and I hear women say this in particular. I hear my wife say it. I would die without my kids. I understand the sentiment. How could you check it? It's right. You should love your family. You should love them dearly. But it's not the right perspective on it. There's nothing wrong with the expression, but you do have to have the checking influence of saying, yes, but one day my children will be taken from me. I may not see it, or I may see it. If I do see it, how am I going to deal with that? If I don't see it, I know that they're going to go after me, and I know that they're in God's hands. And so you just need the balancing, and Jonson has the balance always right. That's why he's so valued as I would say, classical poet. He has this decorum about his sentiment and its expression. Any comments or questions about that before I take a brief break? Yes?
Just comparing the two with each other.
Yeah. I mean, I put them side by side for a reason.
I think, at least from what I read, there's kind of even the difference between dealing with a young girl versus a young boy. It's almost
6 months and 7 years.
Yeah.
It's a girl and it's a boy, so there are differences. And also in terms of his life, the one goes before the other. So all these things. What do you think? What do you see here?
Well, I just see an extra layer of gentleness, I think, on the first daughter, which again I think might have to do with the age, but also the femininity of it.
He's more protective.
Yeah, and then even just in the hopes and admirations that he has for this young man, but satisfied that to some degree he fulfilled some of those aspirations, not necessarily to the extent that he had hoped for.
Yeah.
So I think just like even as a father, like wanting to pass down his knowledge, his wisdom to his son so that he can become a great man, he's in some way saying he never like became that great man in one sense.
But it was easier to imagine.
Yes, yeah.
It's hard to imagine a 6-month-old child as the adult.
Yeah.
There's just not enough there to work with.
Yeah.
They're not even verbal at that stage.
Yeah.
Right? They can't speak. Whereas a 7-year-old boy starts to have his own personality a little bit.
Yeah.
Speaks, has mannerisms, probably mannerisms of his father. He stands the same way, or does certain, you can imagine it, you can see it. And so there's a little bit of letting go on the parents' behalf as well, as you see that. Because with a baby, it's just pure protectiveness. This child is utterly vulnerable. So it's all defensiveness. And thankfully, they can't even move very well, so you don't have to be too defensive. You put the baby down, the baby can't even crawl. Once they start crawling, it's trouble, because they can get into more trouble. So, and then when they can start to walk, oh no, now serious accidents can happen. They can run off when I'm not looking and get it, and bad things can happen. But with that, there's greater autonomy on the child's part. So it's easier to imagine the adulthood where they're now mature. So yeah, I think you're right. And whether it's a girl or a boy, or if it's just the age, I don't know. But it's certainly, I think you're correct. I can imagine it being a girl-boy dynamic as well. But it could also just be age.
Yeah, and I think just the reason I also bring that up is because of the comparison of virginity in the first one.
Yes.
The sense of innocence and purity. That's
True. True.
Which is very much part of like a feminine.
Did she mention virginity in the first?
The Virgin Mary.
Yes.
Like, and again, coming from that theological
yes.
of things.
Yes.
And then a half placed amongst the virgin train.
Yes, you're right.
So
a virgin can be a little girl as well, right?
Yeah.
Not just the sexual aspect.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just like, I think he's really drawing on those two.
You're right, and I mean the word innocence reflects on that as well. There's a little bit more. You're right. There's a little bit more of the sanctity of the child getting an emphasis in a way that's less so here. It's really interesting as a study in contrasts. But both poems entirely appropriate, not a word out of place, well expressed. You feel what Jonson feels, even though he hasn't really talked specifically about his feelings. And so what he does as a poet is what a poet should do. He doesn't tell you what he feels, he makes you feel what he feels. Telling people about your feelings is not the way to get them to sympathize. Bringing them to feel what you feel, that's how you do it. But you don't do that by talking about yourself. Don't be a narcissist. Really hard in our day because we're encouraged to be narcissists. Social media particularly encourages it. Terrible. Gosh, do I hate it in that sense. It so goes against the sensibilities of maturity. Self-promotion, it's just part of it. Any other comments or questions? Anyone have an observation on this? Either comparing them. But again, the theological framing of it, I think, is key in all of this. There's no doubt about the fact that Jonson is thinking as a Catholic poet, thinking about the consolations of the faith and the transience of life and the inevitability of death, and yet God's remedy for death, which is resurrection. Okay, well then I'm going to pause, take a wee